the Battle of Verneuil in 1424. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Mike Jones, who will be known through his work on Bosworth, Margaret Beaufort, Agincourt, and also actually on the Eastern Front in the Second World War.
I won't talk about that.
He's going to talk about the Battle of Verneuil, which I suspect relatively few people in the room might have heard of, but a victory for the English in 1424.
Anne, in terms of timing, when would you like me to stop?
Shortly after 5, if possible.
Shortly after 5. So this. How are the acoustics at the back? Good. This is going to be a rapid ride through the Battle of Verneuil. Just to start with the date, the Battle of Verneuil is fought on the 17th of August 1424. So it's some 9 years after Agincourt. And it's one of the big 4 English victories over France: Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, and Verneuil. And Verneuil is almost certainly the least known. How many of you here really knew anything about Verneuil or know anything? Don't be shy. Come on. You're quite a few, yes. So it's interesting that it was sometimes called a second Agincourt, but has become as obscure as Agincourt has become famous. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the story of this battle, to show how it was similar to Agincourt, but also how in some important respects it was very different, and to look at the broader question of how one became so well known, Agincourt, and the other kind of just faded away altogether. So let's start with an eyewitness account. Jean de Vorin, who witnessed the Battle of Agincourt on the French side, so he was a 15-year-old page, so he was watching proceedings, he was watching the unfolding disaster from the rear, which is the best place probably to be, as I think you've all got the sense of now. He went on to fight on the English side, because of course England then allied with Burgundy and also Brittany. This is at the time of the Treaty of Troyes. So he fought in a number of battles at Cravant and also Verneuil, and he also fought at that disastrous battle at Patay, where Joan of Arc actually turned up in the evening after the battle was won, so I don't think she was doing much charging. And he said simply, of all the battles I have fought in or heard about, Verneuil was the best. It was the hardest fought battle. So Jean de Vorin singled out Verneuil as being something very special, and he distinguished it from Agincourt as being a harder fought, more evenly matched battle. And I think part of the story here is to reflect on a tale of 4 brothers, Henry V and his 3 brothers, Thomas, John and Humphrey. So Henry V has won Agincourt, which on one level would be an inspiration to all these brothers, but I think was also a kind of shadow. How do I deal with that? Do I try and do one better, or do I try and carry on the legacy, or what? So Thomas, Duke of Clarence, of course, led the expedition to France in 1412 in the reign of Henry IV. Thomas missed Agincourt. He was sent home because of dysentery. At least that was the official announcement, although the chaplain's account, the Jester Henrici Quinti, suggests that when the war captains, were debating what to do after the capture of Harfleur, Thomas publicly opposed Henry's wish to march on Calais. So it could have been a bit different from just dysentery, but whatever the explanation, Thomas wasn't there. So he, it seems, decided to go one better than Henry, and he tried to win a battle probably the most ridiculous battle of the 100 Years' War. He rode off to meet a French and Scottish army midway through supper. Please do not attempt this during the conference. No reconnaissance in the twilight. He left all his archers behind, and the battle was a catastrophe, and he was killed, and a lot of other English were killed or captured. So much for trying to do one better. Humphrey, of course, was at Agincourt and always remembered it because he was knocked to the ground and the king fought over his body to stop him being dragged away by the French. And so Humphrey became a kind of custodian of Henry V's legacy. He backed the plan to attack Orleans in 1428, falling out with the other brother, John Duke of Bedford, who wanted to attack Angers. And Christopher Ormond drew attention to the fact that in 1421, Henry V brought his entire army, including Humphrey, right down to Orleans and drew them up in battle array outside Orleans for a day and then went off again as if saying, that's the plan, to break across the Loire at Orleans. And then much later on, Humphrey was resolutely opposing the release of poor Charles, Duke of Orleans. This was in 1440, 25 years after the battle, because Henry V had forbade it in his will until Charles recognized the Treaty of Troyes. So Humphrey's role was a kind of guardian of the legacy. But the hero of this story is John, Duke of Bedford, who became regent of France in 1422 on the death of Henry V, with just this 9-month-old baby, Henry VI, who, when Charles VI, I think no one imagined that Charles VI would outlive Henry V, but remarkably, Charles VI died in November 1422, and at this point, by the Treaty of Troyes, little Henry VI is King of England and France, and Bedford was regent of a dual monarchy on behalf of little infant Henry VI. And the core of both the battle story and the cause is that Verneuil was Bedford, as regent of France, fighting for the dual monarchy on behalf of this little child. And because a lot of the French did not accept the Treaty of Troyes, so the Treaty of Troyes disinherited, we heard about the Dauphin, the overweight, rather incompetent Dauphin who received that letter of challenge from Henry V at the time of the capture of Harfleur. Some chroniclers unkindly suggested that his death a few months later, he was only 19, was a sort of shock reaction to that challenge. He sort of just, oh my God. But whatever the reason, he wasn't around anymore. His younger brother, Charles VII, was disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes. But a lot of the French aristocracy rallied around his cause. So Bedford was going to have to enforce this treaty by conquest. And there was going to be a lot of opposition. And that really is the context for understanding the Battle of Verneuil. And after Agincourt, I've mentioned Beaujeu. So Beaujeu, a French and Scottish army in March 1421, defeat an English army. So there goes kind of our invincibility. And a little later on, in 1423, the French Count of Aumale, one of the French aristocrats of the party of Charles VII, who had founded a kingdom now around Bourges and the Loire, because of course we have Paris. And if you want, the top third of France now is really held by Bedford. So it's Normandy, the Ile-de-France. We're allied with the Dukes of Brittany and the Dukes of Burgundy. And this is all the Treaty of Troyes, but we're going to have to break across the Loire, hence the power of that moment drawn up before Orleans, to smash this alternative kingdom, the Kingdom of Bourges. And it's a very volatile situation in 1423, 1424. Both sides are winning battles. And after the Battle of La Gravelle, where the Earl of Suffolk was defeated, so Dad was killed Dad died of dysentery at Harfleur. The older brother died at Agincourt, and the younger brother bungled a succession of battles and was then captured by Joan of Arc. So not a happy story for the Earls of Suffolk. But the Earl of Suffolk was defeated by the Count of Aumale. The Count of Aumale basically wrote to Charles VII and said, we don't need to be afraid of the English, and we can take you to Reims and crown you properly. This idea was later borrowed by Joan of Arc and successfully carried out on the 17th of July, 1429. But in 1423-4, the plan of the French who support Charles VII is they are, to sort of cautiously enter the periphery of this debate, they're willing to take on the English in battle, win the battle, march across Burgundian territory, get to Reims, and crown Charles properly. And all this will change after Verneuil. So it's really about enforcing the Treaty of Troyes. So it's kind of carrying on with what Henry set up right in May 1420. Both sides are up for a fight, so that there is a sense from the spring of 1424 that there's going to be a big battle, and both sides are preparing for it. The French, so when I say the French, and I need to be careful here, so the French who are supporting Charles VII bring in the Scots again. So a French and Scottish army won the Battle of Beaujeu. There's one major port. This is quite a striking statistic, but there's one major port left for Charles VII's regime. So if you imagine, including Gascony, that's La Rochelle. So any French coming down to join are going to have to make for that port. But the Earl of Douglas, now sort of battle wounds and mutilation have already featured in this conference. I want to say the Earl of Douglas shows up with a 4,000 strong army. And this is all part of the Valois preparation. And the Earl of Douglas was captured at Homildon Hill by the Percys. He then got on so well with Henry Percy Hotspur that he fought with him, despite being an interesting dimension to this, behavior of prisoners. Well, you're my prisoner, but actually I'd love to fight. Okay, so he's actually fighting with his captor at the Battle of Shrewsbury. And there's a popular song went that was reprised during the Battle of Verneuil. So he loses an eye in one battle and a testicle in the other. So by 1403, he's lost an eye and a testicle, and he's going to lose rather more in Verneuil. And as the English were pushing towards victory, according to two sources, they struck up a spontaneous song dedicated to the Earl of Douglas and the Scots, just sort of enjoyably reminding them of parts of their anatomy that were now going to disappear forever. But that's jumping a little bit ahead. So I think you've sensed this is going to be a French and Scottish army that's being prepared, but there's an additional ingredient which Mark kind of helpfully prepped for me, which is specialist cavalry from the plains of Lombardy, from Milan, between 1,000 and 2,000 properly armoured cavalry in plate armour. And Mark is saying that in northern Italy, this is something that's being developed in the 1420s. And we're seeing a considerable sum of money being paid to get these specialist troops in that are going to be fully armoured. So Scottish Chronicle sources tell us that Douglas's army contains a substantial proportion of bowmen. We've also got fully armoured cavalry who are going to make a very dramatic intervention in the battle. So the French are really preparing for this over months and months and paying a great deal of money. So they clearly take this very seriously. They want to engage the English in battle and they want to win. And equally, the Duke of Bedford, as regent, is also preparing very carefully. And his army is going to be, and this is very important for the whole argument, an Anglo-Norman army, just as we should rightly say that Poitiers is not an English army, but an Anglo-Gascon army. I'm not desperately trying to get in Gilham's good books. It really should be. It's an Anglo-Gascon army, and Verneuil is an Anglo-Norman army. Because what happened after the Treaty of Troyes was that although major Norman landowners, aristocrats, went over to the side of Charles VII, the lesser nobility, by and large, stay loyal to Bedford. And if you read Norman chroniclers, particularly Thomas Bassin, who is a major source for Bedford's administration and also the battle, Bedford is very popular in Normandy. He is respected for the fair way he governs the country. His administration and his government are well regarded, and regarded as a lot better than areas under the administration of Charles VII. So thumbs up for Bedford already. And this means that a lot of the lesser nobility of Normandy, when summoned, quite happily show up. So it is an Anglo-Norman army. In addition, militias, town militias from Normandy and some of the Ile-de-France come in, and then the Burgundians. So initially, Bedford is very keen to bring the Burgundians in. We're allied with Burgundy by the Treaty of Troyes, and Bedford wants to show everyone that this alliance is working. So both sides are doing a lot of preparation. And after all this preparation, the intention is that it's going to be a set-piece battle, what is called a journée in chivalric protocol. And as you see, chivalry is both respected and also sometimes not respected. So the idea is that the English are besieging Ivry, the captain of Ivry will appeal for help, and on a certain day, which is going to be the 15th of August, 1424, 2 days earlier, there should be this set-piece battle. Both sides have agreed to it. They're both going to assemble on the plain outside Ivry and fight an agreed battle. So that's the deal. So Bedford is preparing for this and shows up on the 15th with his army, no French. And Bedford is furious. The French approach and then decide they're going to do something different. So this is a bit like Agincourt, and these, the professionals, Boucicaut and Albret, saying, we've got a good battle plan, let's stick to it. And Orléans, Bourbon, Alençon saying, sorry, no. and what I think happened this time, it's picked up in the French chroniclers again, rash youth versus wise old counsel, and however they're describing it, is that some wise heads say, look, we've made a proper agreement here, we need to stick to it, and they're overruled. And the important thing here, again, is the strange echo. Who is going to be commanding the French army? And initially, Charles VII was going to be commanding it. And then at the last moment, they say, we can't afford to risk having you in command. But the problem is, it's very unclear who will be in command instead. And so we have a Scottish army that's commanded by Douglas. There's Aumale, and the highest ranking aristocrat is the Duke of Alençon. I love the Alençon family. It's a great grandfather. The Count of Alençon kind of creates the conditions for mucking up Crécy, because he starts the battle before the King of France even appears, Philip VI even appears. Several generations later, the Duke of Alençon at Agincourt is the only person left to command the second line of infantry, and then at the last moment he says, hell, I'm joining the front line, so there's no command or control whatsoever, and then he abandons his retinue in an attempt to try and kill Henry V. And now we've got his son in command at Verneuil, nominally, and Alençon says, I'm not going to this set-piece battle, I'm going to liberate my own lands. And so he heads off towards Verneuil and the southeast of Normandy, where he is welcome. He's let into Verneuil, and everyone's saying, yes, okay, and in this area we'll welcome you back. So there was a kind of, I want to liberate my lands from Alençon, supported by some of the aristocrats. And the other key thing was the Milanese cavalry had not yet arrived, and this was a big deal, that they'd got to Tours on the 13th of August. So by swinging away from the agreed battle site and delaying things, it ensured the Milanese cavalry would show up. And that was to be a very important part of the thinking. Now, Bedford was absolutely furious. Bedford was normally a very careful man, a very considered man, but after the French-Belgian agreement, he is just totally different. He is furious, and this anger, this kind of righteous anger, propels him and his army from. At Ivry, he had prepared a defensive position where the back of his army protected. There was a hill behind, so the French couldn't get behind. Proper protected position from his archers, so on and so forth. And then it's like, what the hell, we're going after these guys, and it kind of terrain, everything else is just secondary. It's those, those French have broken this solemn agreement. This can't happen. So Bedford's blood is up. And these were two kind of full days between the 15th and the 17th, because two very interesting things happened. First of all, numbers. The English army is around 8,500 men, and the French between 14 to 16,000. So outnumbered again. And Bedford has just wondrous, great ceremony welcomed the Burgundian contingent in, between 1,000 and 2,000 good troops. And after the fiasco at Ivry, he tells the Burgundians to go away again. So you're an ordinary soldier and you're wondering what's going on and we're outnumbered, but then suddenly the Burgundians who've been welcomed are sent away again. But there's going to be two explanations for this. And the other is Bedford's fury, having sort of been vented a bit on the Burgundians, is now trained on the Scots. And Bedford announces, when we actually meet the Scots, there is going to be no quarter. So we're going to fight to the death. We're not going to take any prisoners. So, boy, this is a roller coaster ride. And it's all, chivalric oath. Then we get a sequence. So the first thing, and it's the only explanation I can think of, is that secret negotiations have been going on between the regime of Charles VII and the Dukes of Brittany and Burgundy. And around this time, with this, the Ivry affair, Bedford gets to hear that the Burgundians might actually be secretly negotiating behind his back. So first of all, this is a breach of an oath, the oath of allegiance at the Treaty of Troyes. And in practical terms, it is, my God, what's going on? These Burgundians might actually betray us during the battle. So when people say, what on earth is going on? The Burgundians are being sent away. It's both around chivalry, but also practicality. Bedford is saying, we're going to fight this battle only with the people we really trust. And this turns out, it's risky, but it turns out to be battle winning. And again, it's not numbers, it is the people we really trust. So the Burgundians leave again, having just arrived. And with the Scots, it's also around the oath, because King James I has been released, and part of that agreement is no further Scottish army. It doesn't cover Scots who are already fighting in France, but no new Scottish army will be sent under the terms of the release agreement to support Charles VII. So Bedford now gets very scrupulous and says they've broken that agreement, so we're not going to respect any agreements about, conventions of war. They're rebels, they're oath breakers, and we're just going to fight to the death. So, boy, things are hotting up. Well, battle is not far away, because the English marching towards Verneuil find, as they come through, they're coming northeast towards Verneuil, they find on the 17th of August this huge French and Scottish and Lombard army waiting to meet them. And the terrain is now a disaster for the English. It's an open plain, and it's inclining, so that the cavalry are now going to be riding downhill towards the English. And the last beautiful detail is the ground is baked hard, and it's very hard to hammer in the protective stakes. So there's a lot. This Bedford has just become this is Lee at Gettysburg. The blood is up, and Bedford has just thrown caution to the winds. Careful Bedford. And I think this is also the just thinking, this is the legacy of Agincourt, somehow around here as well. So, our best sources for this battle are interestingly the Norman sources. And the interpretation of this battle is quite difficult, and I've got very little time. But the way I interpret it, based primarily on the Bassin and the other Norman chronicles, is, I'll put it very bluntly, the Lombard cavalry line up in front of the French army. They are not on the wings. They are in front, and they start riding. So, the archers are trying to get their stakes in. There is a body of archers in front of the English army, and the cavalry just ride through them. And then there's this extraordinary moment described in Bassin where the men-at-arms just drop to the ground and let the cavalry ride over them. And then the cavalry disperse the rear guard and the baggage train. People flee and announce the battle is lost. So it's not a good start. So the cavalry, ineffective at Agincourt, is extremely effective. And if the Lombard cavalry return, they're now just riding off, plundering mercenaries. It's going to be the end. So we have a battle speech here. Bedford, basically, this is from Sir John Fastolf, who was very, very close to Bedford, standing very, very close to him at this time. Bedford saw everyone just thinking, what is going on? And I've got all my possessions in the baggage train. Bedford basically said, well, it's possessions or eternal glory. Let's go for the French. So these dismounted men-at-arms picked themselves up and started advancing on the dismounted French men-at-arms, and they meet each other in a huge crashing battle that Varan described as the hardest he'd ever experienced. And having no commander and thinking the battle is won, the French and the Scottish men-at-arms get out of alignment. And this is a crucial tactical point. Anyway, ferocious fighting with the Lombard cavalry possibly coming up at any stage. And Jean de Varan said at the end, we pulled off this amazing victory. I have no idea how we did it. I was just trying to save my life. And he went round to lots of other soldiers who said, absolutely amazing. We beat the French and the Scots. I have no idea how we did it. I was fighting to save my life. But over time, talking to a lot of soldiers, people said there was that great shout, that extraordinary sound, and it was the archers joining them. The archers, I believe, that were ridden down, picked themselves up, and rather like Agincourt, joined in with hand weapons. And they pushed the French back, and they finally pushed the French and the Scots all the way back into the huge ditches outside Verneuil. And they start, at this moment, everyone's saying, sheep wash for the Scots. They're going to drown them all in the ditch. This is not nice stuff. And they duly do. And this huge surge of energy. And then the Lombards appear at the end. So it's an extraordinary turnaround and incredibly dramatic. So I'm going to round up now. What ways was this battle different to the Battle of Agincourt? Well, firstly, we have this situation where the terrain, so carefully, effectively used at Agincourt to protect the archers, the terrain is disastrous. We have cavalry useless at Agincourt, highly effective at Verneuil. So two ingredients that are very different, and the army that wins is an Anglo-Norman army, not an English army, and according to Norman chroniclers, it's a Norman aristocrat, lesser aristocrat, John Seigneur de Sane, who at the crucial moment when the dismounted men-at-arms are fighting, the banner, as key standard of the English, is captured by the French. He fights in with his Norman mates and gets it back again. So this is an Anglo-Norman army, and that's very important as well. What are the ways it's similar to Agincourt? In a way, Verneuil carries on the idea of Agincourt ritually, the ritual ingredients of Agincourt. Firstly, on the 14th of August, so just before Ivry, Bedford holds a pageant, and in this pageant he He's representing the arms of France, the White Cross, the Red Cross. He also has a blue gown, ermine collar, and this is Jenny Stratford's work that Jenny has suggested, I think very plausibly, that this is he is representing the sovereign's robe of St. George and the Order of the Garter, so that he's really saying to his army, this is about chivalry, pointing to the knot, the binding power of chivalry, that this is all going to be about the oath. And when the French break their oath, this ritual becomes incredibly powerful. So this idea of St. George binding together the English and the Normans in a common cause, which is a feature of Agincourt, I would say is taken even further at Verneuil. And the second ingredient is extraordinary army unity at a moment in crisis. So at Agincourt, when the French and the English dismounted men-at-arms meet, the archers pitch in with hand weapons. And at Verneuil, the archers pick themselves up, and again, largely with hand weapons, just join in the fighting, although they're not well armoured. Now, we have this notion of a band of brothers at Agincourt. It's made tangible after Verneuil, because every archer who fights, who can prove that he's fought, is given a grant of land. So the idea that war is ennobling, and that by fighting well you become a noble, becomes tangible, not at Agincourt, but at Verneuil. Both battles have a decisive impact in the short term. Agincourt, Normandy is conquered. After Verneuil, Bedford conquers Maine, part of Anjou, and the English are set up to break across the Loire and win the war. So Verneuil deserves to be remembered. And my final point would be this, that if we hadn't had Verneuil, the forgotten battle, and if the French hadn't lost Verneuil, I do not believe in February 1429, when a peasant girl, hearing strange voices and seeing strange visions, turned up at Chinon and was held outside the town for 2 days while the French debated whether to even consider letting her lead an army, she would have ever got in. After Verneuil, the French were so desperate, I believe, that they took the view, repeated by some of their soldiers, we may have a witch leading an army, but at least she's a good one. So that's it. Thank you very much.